The day started like any other in the busy studio of The View. The audience had begun to fill the seats. The cameras were being tested, and the crew hurried across the bright floor with their clipboards and headsets. Everyone was talking about the guest who would be arriving that morning, Keanu Reeves. His name alone carried a certain warmth, a quiet kind of excitement that didn't come from scandal or controversy, but from genuine admiration. He wasn't known for chasing headlines or stirring drama. He was known for kindness, for humility, for being the person who helped others without wanting the world to notice. The producers of the show had been thrilled when he agreed to come. They wanted the interview to be easygoing, a pleasant conversation about his new movie, his career, and maybe a few light stories about life on set. They knew viewers loved him for his modest nature and calm spirit. Many people who worked behind the cameras were secretly fans too. Some even whispered that he was the kind of celebrity who made them believe good people could survive in Hollywood. When Keanu arrived at the studio, it was early morning. He stepped out of a dark car wearing his usual simple clothes, nothing fancy, just a plain jacket, jeans, and that calm half-smile that seemed to put everyone at ease. A few fans who had gathered near the entrance waved, and he waved back. One of the security guards later said that he thanked almost everyone he met that morning: the driver, the receptionist, even the barista who brought him coffee. His quiet politeness filled the air around him, and for a moment the chaotic set felt calm. Inside, the hosts were finishing their makeup and last-minute notes. The mood in the dressing room was cheerful. Joy Behar, who had been with the show for many years, was chatting with her co-hosts about what questions they should ask. She was known for her sharp humor and directness. She liked to challenge people, not out of malice, but because she believed that's what made good television. Still, everyone knew that sometimes her words could hit harder than she intended. That morning, though, there was no sign of tension, just light jokes and coffee cups. Keanu was guided through the hallway by one of the producers. He stopped to greet a few of the stagehands, shook hands with the sound technician, and laughed softly when someone mentioned how their mother loved The Matrix. When he entered the backstage area, one of the assistant producers reminded him that they'd start in 5 minutes. He nodded, thanked her, and took a deep breath. For someone who had spent most of his life in front of cameras, he still looked a little shy, like he preferred to listen rather than talk. As the music for the show began to play, the audience clapped and cheered. The bright lights switched on, and the familiar opening rolled across the screens. The hosts welcomed viewers with big smiles, introducing the topics of the day. After a few laughs and quick headlines, the time came for their special guest. The crowd clapped louder when Keanu walked onto the stage. He gave a small wave, smiling shyly as he sat down. It wasn't the flashy, overconfident kind of entrance most stars made. It was simple, genuine, and instantly charming. Joy welcomed him warmly. "It's so great to have you here," she said. "You've been busy lately." He nodded modestly. "Yeah, I've been lucky to be part of some really good projects. From the start, everything felt comfortable." They talked about his new film, about his love for motorcycles, and about how he still rode the subway sometimes. The audience laughed when he told a funny story about a fan who didn't recognize him because he was wearing a mask. He spoke softly but with thought, choosing his words carefully, never trying to sound smarter than anyone else. It was the kind of interview that reminded people why they liked him so much. He felt real. Behind the cameras, the crew relaxed. It seemed like everything was going smoothly. The chemistry on stage was good, the jokes landed naturally, and the audience was engaged. But then, as the conversation moved toward deeper subjects, fame, social responsibility, and how Hollywood shapes the world, the tone began to shift slightly. It wasn't sudden or hostile, just subtle enough that a few people backstage exchanged looks. Joy leaned forward, curious. "You've been praised for being very private and grounded," she said. "But in an age where so many public figures use their platform to speak on big issues, political, social, do you ever feel you have a responsibility to take a stand?" Keanu smiled politely. He paused for a second before answering, the way he always did when he wanted to be thoughtful. "I think everyone has a responsibility to be kind," he said, "to treat people with respect and do good in the ways they can. For me, that means helping quietly. I'm not sure the world needs another person shouting about what's right or wrong." The crowd responded with soft applause. It was a humble answer, but Joy wasn't quite done. She had always believed that silence on important topics could be dangerous. and she didn't want the conversation to drift away from that point. "But don't you think," she continued, "that sometimes staying quiet can also send a message? That it can look like avoidance?" Her tone wasn't harsh, it was probing, journalistic, but something about it carried an edge. Keanu didn't look offended. He simply nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the fairness of the question. "That's a good point," he said. "I just think action means more than words. Talking helps, yes, but if you're not living it, if you're not practicing kindness in real life, what do the words mean?" The exchange was calm, even thoughtful, but the mood in the room had changed a little. The audience, sensing something deeper happening, grew quieter. One of the co-hosts quickly tried to lighten the moment with a joke about how she wished she had Keanu's patience. Laughter broke the tension for a moment, and the conversation moved back to safer ground. His charity work, his creative process, his love for storytelling. Yet something lingered under the surface. Joy kept watching him, not with hostility but with curiosity. She wasn't used to guests who answered so simply, who didn't play into the drama or give rehearsed headline-ready statements. Keanu wasn't trying to impress or defend himself. He was just being honest, and sometimes honesty without decoration could be disarming. As the segment went on, the producer in the control room gave quiet signals through the headset, timing every minute. They were pleased so far. The ratings would be good. Keanu's presence alone drew eyes, but one producer noted that the energy felt different, less like an interview and more like two worldviews brushing against each other. When the cameras cut to commercial, the hosts leaned back for a quick breather. Joy made a light comment about how she always ends up asking the deep questions, and Keanu chuckled. He didn't seem upset. He even turned to one of the other hosts and asked about her recent project. Off camera, he was just as calm as he was on. He had a kind of stillness that filled the space, quiet but steady. The makeup artist rushed in to touch up a bit of powder, and he thanked her as though she'd done something heroic. Then came the signal for the next segment. The audience clapped again as the show returned live. The producer had written a new cue card, this one suggesting a slightly more serious question about Hollywood's role in shaping cultural values. Joy picked it up naturally. That was her style, to ask what others might avoid. She didn't mean harm, she just loved discussion. She thrived on the back and forth on testing ideas. "So, Keanu," she said once the applause faded, "you've been in Hollywood for decades now. You've seen how movies and celebrities can influence what people believe. Do you think actors like yourself have a duty to speak up about the problems in society, or should entertainment stay separate from politics?" The question hung in the air for a moment. The room went very still. Even the sound of the cameras seemed quieter. Keanu looked thoughtful, not defensive. His eyes softened a bit and he tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to express himself carefully. "I think movies have power," he said slowly. "Stories shape how we see the world, but I also think people need room to think for themselves. My job is to tell stories that make people feel or reflect, not to tell them what to believe. I trust the audience. I believe most people are good and can make their own choices." The words came gently, but they carried weight. Joy nodded but pressed again. "But don't you think that being neutral, especially in today's climate, can sometimes be the same as taking a side?" A few audience members murmured. One of the other hosts shifted slightly in her seat, sensing the subtle tension. Keanu didn't raise his voice or change his tone. "I don't think kindness is neutral," he said. "It's active. It takes effort. You can disagree with someone and still treat them with care. That's not taking sides, that's being human." The audience clapped again, louder this time. Joy smiled, though it was clear she was thinking hard about his answer. She appreciated honesty, even when it challenged her. Still, the moment marked a small turning point in the interview. What had started as a friendly talk about art and life had become something deeper, a real conversation about values, empathy, and the responsibility that comes with influence. Backstage, the producers exchanged looks. They could tell this episode would get attention. The contrast between Keanu's quiet philosophy and Joy's passionate questioning made for compelling television. But they also worried about balance, how to keep the tone respectful while maintaining the spark that made people watch. As the final minutes of the segment approached, Keanu was asked one more question about his outlook on life. "You've been through a lot," one of the hosts said gently. "Yet people always describe you as kind, humble, grounded. What keeps you that way?" He smiled, almost embarrassed. I don't know, he said softly. Life can be hard. Everyone has something they're carrying. I just try to remember that you never really know what someone else is going through. A little patience, a little understanding, it goes a long way. The studio was quiet for a moment. It was one of those rare times on live television when silence felt meaningful instead of awkward. The host smiled warmly. Joy nodded too, maybe realizing that the conversation, while intense at times, had led to something honest. As the cameras panned out and the outro music played, Keanu thanked the hosts sincerely. He shook hands with each of them, even gave a quick wave to the audience before stepping off the stage. The crew applauded quietly, something they didn't usually do for guests. He smiled, thanked them again, and disappeared behind the curtain. Backstage, the atmosphere buzzed with talk. Some of the crew said it was one of the most genuine interviews they'd seen. Others whispered that Joy had pushed a little too far, though she didn't seem upset. She was pacing slightly, thoughtful, replaying the conversation in her mind. For her, interviews were about connection and challenge. She liked to push ideas until the truth revealed itself. But she also respected sincerity, and Keanu had shown plenty of that. In the hallway, Keanu spoke briefly with one of the producers, thanking them for having him on the show. He said he appreciated the questions, even the tough ones. Then he smiled that calm, knowing smile again, the one that said he'd long learned how to stay centered no matter how noisy the world around him became. Outside, the sun was brighter than when he'd arrived. Fans were still waiting near the entrance. He took a few moments to greet them, signing a couple of posters and taking a quick photo with a family who had been standing there since morning. Before he left, he looked back at the building as if reflecting for a second on what had just happened. To him, it was just another conversation, an honest exchange of ideas. But inside the studio, everyone knew that something about that morning felt different. What no one realized yet was that the conversation they had just witnessed, the gentle clash between empathy and confrontation, was only the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the studio walls. The energy backstage was still buzzing when the cameras stopped rolling. It was an unexpected shift. What had started as a regular celebrity interview had morphed into something more. Keanu Reeves had walked off the stage calmly, with the same quiet composure that had earned him respect throughout his career. But behind the scenes, people were talking. Whispers spread quickly through the studio, and the usual light-hearted chatter had been replaced with an underlying tension. Joy Behar, the show's co-host who was known for her sharp wit and unflinching questions, had been at the center of the storm. She wasn't someone to shy away from difficult discussions, but this one felt different. She hadn't expected the conversation to take such a turn. She didn't regret asking the questions. She was just surprised by how personal and thoughtful Keanu's answers had been. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't gotten defensive, but there was something about his response that had made her feel like she had to challenge him even more. Back in the green room, Joy sat quietly for a moment, staring at the floor. She wasn't upset, but she was reflective. She had never been one to back down from a conversation, but something about Keanu's approach made her question her own. She'd pushed hard, asked her usual probing questions, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his calmness had made her seem more forceful than she intended. It wasn't that he hadn't given good answers, he had. It was the way he carried himself, the way he didn't get drawn into the usual celebrity drama. In some ways, he'd made her feel like she needed to reassess her approach. Keanu, on the other hand, was already making his way through the back hallways, unbothered. He wasn't used to the type of uproar his presence often caused. For him, the experience felt like any other interview. Sure, there were cameras and lights, but it had always been more about the people in front of him than the audience watching from a distance. He wasn't interested in grand gestures or playing to a crowd. He was interested in the truth, however quietly it came out. He had expected to talk about his latest movie. He had expected a few lighthearted questions about his hobbies, maybe a funny story or two. What he hadn't expected was the shift in the conversation, toward politics, responsibility, and the moral weight of fame. But he wasn't angry or upset. He was just surprised, not by the questions themselves, but by the fact that they had gone deeper than he had anticipated. As he walked past the various sets and meeting rooms, he found himself thinking about the last few minutes of the interview. His response to Joy's question about celebrity responsibility had been honest, but maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe he could have said more. He reached the dressing room where his publicist was waiting with a few notes about his next appearance. The publicist looked up from the paperwork and offered a small smile. "How did it go?" Keanu thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine, interesting. I just didn't expect it to go in that direction." The publicist nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Keanu didn't often talk about the deeper issues in public. He preferred to keep his personal views private, letting his actions speak louder than any statement he could make. It wasn't that he didn't care about the world around him, quite the opposite. It was just that he had always believed that real change came from quiet, consistent effort, not from grand speeches. "I think people were impressed," the publicist said, glancing at the monitor where they could see the interview replaying on a loop. "You handled it well. There's already talk online." Keanu gave a small half-smile. "Talk online, huh?" The publicist nodded, tapping away at the phone. "You know how it is. Some people loved it. Others are, let's say, not as enthusiastic." Keanu didn't mind. In fact, he was used to it. His life had been full of public opinions, some positive, some negative, but in the end it didn't change who he was or how he viewed the world. He didn't crave attention, and he didn't mind being misunderstood. "I guess we'll see how it plays out," he said quietly. Meanwhile, back in the studio, the rest of the hosts were gathering in the makeup room, reviewing the footage. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, but it wasn't just the usual post-interview excitement. This time there was something deeper. They were all still trying to process what had just happened. Joy, who had a reputation for being quick-witted and not afraid to ask the hard questions, was the one who seemed most affected by the exchange. As the other hosts sat down to review their notes and prep for the next segment, she remained a little quiet, almost distant. She had always prided herself on being able to go toe-to-toe with anyone in an interview, but something about Keanu had made her rethink her usual approach. He had been calm, kind, and resolute in his beliefs, and despite the difference in their viewpoints, he had never once seemed uncomfortable. "Are we sure he's really this unflappable?" one of the co-hosts asked as they watched the final replay of the interview. "I mean, he just left the stage like it was nothing." Joy shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the screen. "I've seen a lot of guests, but there's something about him, he's different. I didn't expect him to stay so composed, especially with how I pushed him." The producer, who had been listening in, raised an eyebrow. "You think you pushed too hard?" Joy thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I don't regret asking the tough questions, but I'll admit I might have been a little more aggressive than usual." She paused. "Maybe I wasn't expecting him to be so calm about it." Another co-host leaned in. "Well, he's certainly not like any of the usual celebrities we get on this show. He's not here for the drama. He's just being himself." That was the thing about Keanu. He didn't play the Hollywood game. He didn't try to manipulate the media or build a public persona. What you saw was what you got. No filters, no artifice. In a world where most people were driven by fame, fortune, and the desire to be liked, Keanu had remained grounded. His popularity wasn't based on controversy, scandals, or gossip. It was built on genuine, simple moments, the kind of moments that most people could relate to. But now the show's producers were beginning to see something they hadn't expected. There was a buzz forming around the interview, and not just the usual celebrity buzz. No, this was different. People were talking about Keanu's approach to life, his quiet demeanor, and his views on responsibility and fame. Some viewers were praising him for his calm wisdom. Others, however, felt uncomfortable with his refusal to take a clear stance on the hot-button issues of the day. As the hours passed, the conversation about Keanu's appearance on The View spread beyond the studio. On social media, people were quick to pick sides. Some praised his humble nature, calling him the only real one left in Hollywood. Others took issue with his comments, accusing him of being apathetic or too passive. The conversation became heated, with people debating whether Keanu was right to avoid taking a stronger public stance on social and political issues. Back at the studio, the crew was still processing the whirlwind that had followed. The producers, who had expected an easygoing segment, were now scrambling to manage the fallout. Some were worried about how this would affect the show's ratings. Others were more concerned with the longer-term impact. whether this kind of discussion would lead to a shift in how future interviews were handled. Joy, for her part, didn't seem to mind the attention. In fact, she was more focused on the conversation itself than the headlines it might generate. She knew that sometimes the most important conversations were the ones that made people uncomfortable, the ones that challenged long-held beliefs. But as the hours ticked by, she found herself questioning whether she had pushed Keanu too far. Had she truly been fair in her questioning? Or had she just been doing her job trying to get a headline? She wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. This interview and the reaction it had sparked would be remembered for a long time. As the day came to a close, the studio began to quiet down. The crew started packing up their equipment and the hosts left the set, each of them with their own thoughts about what had just transpired. Keanu had already left, heading back to his hotel to rest before his next appearance. But the impact of the conversation lingered. That night, as Joy sat in her dressing room, she reflected on the interview. It hadn't gone the way she had expected. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it was the unexpected moments, the ones that caught everyone off guard, that were the most important. She knew that people would be talking about Keanu for days to come. But she also knew that he had reminded everyone of something simple yet powerful. Kindness.
Humility and the importance of listening, really listening to others. For Joy,
that was the real takeaway from the interview. And the day after Keanu's interview on The View, the buzz around his appearance was still swirling. It wasn't just the usual chatter about what a guest wore or how charming they were. No, this time it felt different. The interview had struck a chord and people were still talking, both online and in real life. For some, Keanu's calm responses and refusal to be drawn into the usual drama of Hollywood had made him a symbol of peace in an otherwise chaotic world. For others, his silence on certain topics left them questioning whether he was simply avoiding responsibility or whether he was actually living by his own principles of humility and kindness. The conversation quickly spread, beyond the usual fans of The View. On social media, debates raged in comment sections, people sharing clips of Keanu's responses, dissecting every word. Some praised him for sticking to his beliefs and for not engaging in the typical celebrity circus. Others criticized him for being too neutral, saying that his refusal to take a strong stance on pressing issues came off as detached or disengaged. It wasn't uncommon for a celebrity to be picked apart after an interview, but this one felt more personal, as if people weren't just debating the content of what was said, but the essence of who Keanu was as a person. Joy Behar, still reflecting on the interview, sat in her dressing room that morning with a cup of coffee, replaying the conversation in her mind. She wasn't upset about how the interview had gone. If anything, she felt more energized by it than she had in a long time. She had pushed Keanu hard on some tough topics, but his calm, measured responses had caught her off guard. He didn't just give easy answers. He gave thoughtful, measured ones. It was clear he wasn't trying to win anyone over or play a game. He was simply being himself. But even as she sat there, scrolling through the growing number of online reactions to the interview, Joy couldn't help but wonder, had she been too much? Had she pushed Keanu to a point where he felt cornered? It wasn't like her to second-guess her approach, but there was something about him, something about the way he held himself that made her feel unsure. One of the show's producers knocked lightly on her door, pulling her away from her thoughts. "Hey, Joy, you've got a meeting with the network execs in 15 minutes. They want to talk about the Keanu segment." Joy nodded, setting down her coffee. "Of course. I'll be right there." As she headed out to the meeting, she could feel the buzz in the air. The entire studio was on edge, trying to figure out what the fallout from the interview would mean for the show. The producers knew that The View had become more than just a daytime talk show. It was a space where real conversations happened, whether about politics, social issues, or celebrity culture. But now, with Keanu's interview still fresh in everyone's mind, there was a sense that things had shifted. Maybe, just maybe, the show had entered a new phase. Inside the conference room, the network executives were already seated, and there was a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. "So, Joy," one of them began, "we've been watching the online reactions to Keanu's appearance and, well, it's safe to say it's a bit of a mixed bag." Joy raised an eyebrow, but she didn't seem surprised. She knew how these things worked. Celebrities were often scrutinized after interviews, especially when they said things that didn't fit into the typical media narrative. "I figured as much," she replied, sitting down. One of the execs, a woman with short blonde hair and glasses, continued. "It's clear that people are reacting to Keanu's calm demeanor, but there are also a lot of people questioning whether he should have said more. Some are saying that he's too detached from the issues. Others are praising him for sticking to his principles." "Yeah, that's the thing with Keanu," Joy said thoughtfully. "He doesn't try to be a politician. He doesn't try to fit into a mold. I think that's what makes him so different. People don't know how to react when they meet someone who's just real. He doesn't have a persona, not like most other celebrities." Another exec, a tall man with a deep voice, leaned forward. "That's exactly the problem, Joy. The View has always been about pushing boundaries. We need guests who will give us something to work with. If people just see Keanu as this peaceful, kind guy who avoids the tough questions, they'll tune out. They won't be interested." Joy sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I get it. I really do. But sometimes, I think it's important to show the world that not everyone has to fit into the same mold. Keanu's authenticity is rare, especially in Hollywood, and I think the audience could use a little more of that." The room fell silent for a moment as the execs mulled over her words. Then one of them spoke up. "We're not saying you were wrong to interview him the way you did, but we do need to be careful about the direction we take moving forward. The show needs to stay relevant, and we need guests who can spark conversation, who are willing to take a stance." Joy nodded slowly, but she didn't agree. "Sometimes it's not about taking a stance. Sometimes it's about letting the conversation happen naturally. People want to hear what's real, not just what fits their expectations." The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with the execs offering their feedback and ideas for future segments. It was clear that The View was at a crossroads. The audience wanted more authenticity, but at the same time, the show had to keep the ratings up, and that often meant bringing on guests who were more than just nice guys. They needed drama. They needed sparks to fly, but Joy wasn't sure if that was the kind of show she wanted to be part of anymore. Back in the studio, the crew was preparing for the next taping. The next guest was a well-known actor, famous for his roles in action movies. Unlike Keanu, this actor had no problem with stirring up controversy. His social media posts were often bold and unapologetic, and the producers were hoping his appearance would help drive ratings back up after the quiet, thoughtful interview with Keanu. As the new guest arrived, the crew began to hustle around, adjusting lights and cameras. The energy in the room felt different this time, more charged, more eager for conflict. There was no mistaking it. The producers were hoping for fireworks. Joy, however, wasn't feeling the same energy. She had always been able to throw herself into an interview, feeding off the tension in the room. But today she felt distracted. She couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with the network execs, about the way Keanu had made her question the way she approached her job. Was she wrong to push him so hard? Was the world really in need of more outrage? Or did people just want something real? Something they could hold on to in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. As the show went on, the new guest delivered exactly what the producers had been hoping for. Controversial opinions, quick quips, and moments that would make the headlines. The audience laughed and applauded, but Joy felt a growing discomfort in her chest. The exchange was entertaining, sure, but it didn't feel like a real conversation. It felt like a performance, a carefully curated act designed to create drama. By the end of the show, the guest had stirred up exactly the kind of conversation the producers wanted. People would talk about him for days, debating his comments, sharing his quotes online. But as the cameras stopped rolling and the crew began to pack up, Joy couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The moment she'd shared with Keanu the day before, it had been real. It had been honest. And it had been the kind of conversation that didn't need to be edited or spun into something more dramatic than it was. Later that night, as Joy sat at home watching the online responses to the new episode, she realized something. The conversation with Keanu hadn't just been memorable because of what he said. It had been memorable because of how he said it. He hadn't been afraid to stand by his beliefs even if it made others uncomfortable, and maybe that was what people needed to see more of. Not the anger or the drama, but the ability to stay grounded, to stay true to yourself even when the world is pushing you to do otherwise. Joy wasn't sure where that left her. She had always prided herself on asking tough questions, on challenging her guests to think outside the box. But now she wondered if the world needed something more than challenges. Maybe it needed reminders of what it meant to be human, to listen, to understand, to be kind, even in the face of conflict. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't as flashy as the usual celebrity spectacle. But perhaps in the long run it was more meaningful. The morning after the episode aired, things felt quieter. The View was always buzzing with activity, but there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The producers had expected the usual flow of high-energy conversations and gossip, but today it was different. Behind the scenes, people were talking, people were thinking. Keanu's interview had left a mark, and though it wasn't the kind of mark that could be measured in ratings or social media posts, it was clear that something had changed. The conversations had taken a deeper turn. Viewers weren't just talking about what he said. They were talking about how he said it. His calmness, his refusal to engage in the usual game of media manipulation, had forced them to look at themselves. And now they were reflecting on it. Joy Behar walked into the studio that morning with a sense of uncertainty she wasn't used to. She had never been the type to second-guess herself. She always had an opinion, always knew exactly how she wanted to steer a conversation. But something about her encounter with Keanu had shaken her. She couldn't stop thinking about the interview, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how different it had been from anything she had done before. Keanu hadn't given her any fireworks. There had been no dramatic moments where the interview turned into a shouting match. Instead, he had simply shared his thoughts quietly and honestly, and left it at that. There had been no attempt to twist his words, no effort to keep him in a box that people were comfortable with. He had answered her questions on his own terms, and somehow, that had been the most powerful thing of all. As Joy sat in her dressing room before the taping of the show, she stared at herself in the mirror, thinking about the way she had pushed Keanu. She had been trying to get a reaction, trying to get him to engage in the kind of back and forth that made for good television. But now she realized that what he had given her, what he had given the audience, was something much more valuable. He had shown that it was possible to speak from a place of calm and honesty, without needing to stir up conflict. He had shown that being true to yourself was enough. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the producers knocked on her door, stepping into the room with a clipboard in hand. "Hey Joy, the next guest is ready for you. You're going to need to do your usual thing, okay? Keep things moving." Joy nodded, but she didn't feel the usual rush of excitement. She had done this 1,000 times before, asked the sharp questions, probed for the right sound bites. But today it felt different. She had been reminded that there was more to a conversation than just the pursuit of drama. And it was hard to shake that thought. The next guest was a famous musician known as much for his outspoken opinions as for his music. He had been a controversial figure in the media for years, often stirring up debates with his views on politics and culture. As he sat down on the couch opposite Joy, his energy was different. He was the type of person who loved being the center of attention, who thrived on conflict and the spotlight. And yet, as Joy looked at him, she couldn't help but compare him to Keanu, who, despite being a global superstar, had carried himself with such quiet dignity. "So," Joy began, her voice more subdued than usual, "you've had some strong opinions about recent events. Let's talk about that." The musician leaned forward, ready to engage. He was used to the spotlight and loved the sound of his own voice. "Yeah, I've got a lot to say. The world's a mess, and people need to hear the truth." Joy listened carefully, nodding along, but her mind kept drifting back to the interview with Keanu, the way he had spoken, the way he had avoided the typical traps that so many celebrities fell into. It had made her rethink her approach to the show. She wasn't sure how to explain it to anyone, not even herself, but she couldn't help but feel that there was something more meaningful in the quiet, thoughtful exchanges than in the loud, provocative ones. As the interview with the musician continued, the energy in the studio was unmistakable, intense, dramatic, full of the kind of high stakes that the producers loved. There were sharp exchanges, moments where Joy pressed the musician on his views, challenging him on his contradictions. And while it made for an interesting interview, it didn't feel as satisfying as she had hoped. She had gotten the reaction she expected, but it didn't feel as genuine as the exchange with Keanu. When the interview ended, Joy couldn't shake the feeling that she had just participated in something that wasn't as real as it could have been. The musician had been engaging, sure, but it was all a performance. A carefully crafted act designed to keep the audience on their toes. There was nothing wrong with that. It was just the way things worked in the world of television. But after the interview with Keanu, the contrast was striking. She didn't want to be part of a spectacle anymore. She wanted to have conversations that mattered. Backstage, as Joy took a deep breath and prepared for the next segment, one of the producers came up to her. "Great job on that one, Joy. You really got him to open up there." "Yeah," she said, offering a half smile. "I guess I did." The producer looked at her curiously. "You okay? You seem a little off today." Joy paused, thinking for a moment. "I'm fine, just thinking about something." "It's nothing." But deep down she knew it wasn't nothing. The interview with Keanu had unsettled her in a way that she hadn't expected. She had spent her career chasing after the next big moment, the next dramatic conversation. But now she wondered if that was enough. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. But she knew that the quick exchanges, the sensational moments, weren't fulfilling her the way they used to. Later that evening, as Joy sat at home watching the footage from that day's episode, she felt a sense of emptiness. The interviews had been good, but they hadn't been meaningful in the way she had hoped. The musician had said all the right things, but it had felt like performance art more than a conversation. The energy in the room had been high, but it had also been hollow. She reached for her phone and pulled up the clips from Keanu's interview. Watching them again, she realized just how much his presence had impacted her. He hadn't been trying to win over the audience, hadn't been trying to score points or create a memorable moment. He had simply spoken honestly, in a way that felt genuine, as if he was offering a piece of himself without any expectations in return. Joy felt something stir inside her. She wasn't sure if it was a feeling of regret or if it was something else entirely, but as she watched Keanu's calm demeanor on screen, she realized that she had been looking for the wrong kind of conversation. She had spent so much of her career chasing after drama, after conflict, after the big moments that would get people talking. But now she wasn't sure if that was enough anymore. Maybe what the world needed wasn't more noise, more outrage, but more moments of genuine connection. That night she found herself reflecting on her own career. She had always prided herself on being tough, on pushing her guests to say something bold, something controversial. But what if, instead of pushing for the drama, she could help create space for the kind of conversation that people really needed? What if the goal wasn't to stir up conflict, but to build understanding? The next morning, as Joy prepared for another show, she walked into the studio with a different mindset. She was still going to ask tough questions, still going to challenge her guests. But now, she realized, there was a different kind of challenge she could offer. A challenge to dig deeper, to be real, to be kind. It wouldn't be the easy route. It wouldn't get the loudest reactions. But maybe, just maybe, it would be the most important. As the cameras began rolling, Joy took a deep breath and smiled. Today, she was going to try something different. Today, she wasn't just going to look for the next big headline. She was going to look for the next real conversation. The days after Keanu's interview had passed and the dust seemed to settle, but for Joy Behar, something fundamental had shifted. Her approach to The View was changing. She'd always been known for pushing boundaries, for digging deep into her guests' personal lives and sometimes stirring the pot just enough to get the audience talking. But now, every time she reflected on her interview with Keanu, a feeling gnawed at her, a sense that perhaps she had been missing something all along. That morning, as she sat in the makeup chair before the show, she could feel the weight of the decision she had made. She'd been wrestling with it all week. The truth was, the show had always been about making headlines. It had always been about getting people's attention, making sure that each interview was memorable, that every conversation would spark debate. But after her time with Keanu, she had begun questioning whether that was the kind of conversation she wanted to keep having. The producers had already warned her that they needed her to bring her usual energy, to push her guests, to create those moments of tension. They wanted more of the same, the heated exchanges, the dramatic confrontations, the memorable sound bites. But Joy wasn't sure she could do that anymore. She didn't want to be part of a circus. She wanted to have conversations that felt real. As she applied her lipstick, her mind wandered back to Keanu. The way he had handled himself so effortlessly, his calm demeanor in the face of difficult questions. There had been no outbursts, no anger, no drama. just two people having a conversation. And that for the first time made Joy realize how rare those moments were. Most of her career had been spent chasing after conflict, but now she wasn't sure if she was chasing the right thing. When the taping began, she took her seat at the table with her fellow hosts. The studio was buzzing with the usual pre-show energy, but Joy felt oddly out of place. She tried to shake the feeling, telling herself that she was just overthinking things, but she couldn't ignore the nagging sense that she was about to face another guest. Another interview where the goal was to push them to the limit, to get a rise out of them, to force them into the kind of conversation that would be controversial enough to keep people watching. The next guest was a well-known actor, someone who had made a name for themselves with intense roles in gritty dramas. This actor was known for their outspoken opinions on social issues and was expected to deliver strong, sometimes divisive statements. The producers were hoping for a fiery conversation, something that would get people talking the next day. Joy greeted the actor warmly as they took their seat, but her usual enthusiasm was tempered by the thoughts swirling in her mind. She had been told to bring the heat, to challenge this guest in a way that would make for compelling television. But she wasn't sure if that was what she wanted anymore. "So, you've been very vocal about a number of issues lately," Joy began, her tone still sharp but more thoughtful than before. "What do you think is the biggest problem we're facing right now?" The actor leaned forward, eager to dive into the conversation. "I think the biggest issue right now is people's lack of awareness. People are too comfortable living in their bubbles, ignoring the real problems. The world's on fire and most people just don't seem to care." It was exactly the kind of answer Joy had expected, bold, sweeping, and full of passion. But as she listened, something inside her didn't quite align. She had heard these kinds of answers before, and while they were important, they didn't feel like they were getting to the heart of the issue. The actor had a point, but it felt like they were using the platform to make a statement rather than start a dialogue. She pressed on, as she always did. "But don't you think some of the problems are more complicated than just not caring? Is it really as simple as that?" The actor's eyes narrowed, clearly preparing for the back and forth that would follow. "It's not that simple, of course. But people need to wake up. They need to understand that change starts with them. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem." Joy nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She could feel the conversation spiraling into the usual territory, the realm of slogans and quick answers that didn't really lead anywhere. She had heard this same rhetoric 1,000 times, in interviews with other stars, in political debates, and even in her own personal conversations. It was important, yes, but it often felt like a surface-level discussion. The real work, those nuanced, meaningful conversations, was harder to come by. She paused for a moment before continuing, not with the same sharpness that usually defined her interviews, but with a more reflective tone. "But is the world really that simple? The use versus them narrative, does it help us move forward or does it just divide us more?" The actor seemed taken aback by the shift in tone, their usual confidence faltering for just a moment. They sat back in their chair trying to recalibrate, but Joy had already thrown them off balance. She wasn't interested in the usual back and forth. She wanted to know what was beneath the surface, what truly mattered to this person, not just what they thought people wanted to hear. The actor thought for a moment before responding. "I think the world is complicated, sure, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make things better. We can't keep waiting for someone else to fix things. We all have to take responsibility for the mess we're in." Joy nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the conversation. This was what she had wanted, a moment of depth, a genuine exchange that went beyond the easy answers and the drama. She was starting to feel like she had found what she had been missing in her interviews, the quiet, reflective moments that were often overlooked in the pursuit of spectacle. The interview continued, but the tone had shifted. It wasn't about pushing the guest for controversial opinions or forcing them to say something outrageous. It was about trying to understand their perspective, to dig a little deeper into the complexity of their views. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable. But for the first time in a long time, it felt right. After the segment ended and the camera stopped rolling, Joy sat back in her chair, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The producers were already rushing around discussing the next segment, but Joy couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. The conversation had been productive, thoughtful, and most importantly, real. She hadn't tried to manufacture drama or force the guest into a box. Instead, she had simply allowed the conversation to unfold, trusting that it would take them where it needed to go. As the show wrapped up, Joy felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe The View didn't need to be a place where the loudest voices always won. Maybe it could be a space for the quieter conversations, the ones that didn't need to be about controversy or drama. After all, the world was filled with noise. Maybe what people needed more than ever was a place where they could hear something different, something more human. Later that evening, as Joy watched the show from her couch at home, she smiled as she reflected on the interview. It hadn't been the flashy, high-energy spectacle that she had been used to. But in its own way, it had been the most rewarding conversation she had been part of in a long time. And it made her realize that the true power of an interview wasn't in how much you could stir up. It was in how much you could learn, how much you could connect with someone even in a short amount of time. She wasn't sure where this new direction would take her or the show. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't chasing the drama anymore. She was chasing something much more valuable, the truth. And that, she knew, was what people were really hungry for.